One of the more intriguing things of recent developments has got to be the rise of NFTs. I'm sure many of us have actually seen headlines recently about the sale of these NFTs, these quote-unquote digital arts, for tens of millions of dollars, and it is really quite baffling because, what we're talking about really is the sale of these non-fungible tokens, these digital ownerships over digital art, which essentially are digital files, many of which are widely available already. For example, the sale of the Nyan cat, which is literally the image, ownership of that image, for so much money. And also, I guess the biggest headline recently has got to be how Christie's, this gold standard in the art world, almost a gatekeeper, had actually successfully auctioned off a NFT by this digital artist Beeples for $69 million, in the range that you'd see with some of the traditional art that we've seen. And it really brings a lot of questions to many people. What are we seeing here? Are we seeing the rise of a new class of art? Are we seeing a disruption in the art world? And I think the most baffling being that many of these NFTs, these digital art, essentially files, they are so, first of all, they're not tangible, they are a file, but just the content are so simplistic aesthetically compared to, let's say, an oil painting, that it just shocks people that this is art. And many of the subject matter evidently being, influenced by internet culture, some of it being very meme-like, some of it obviously being a derivative of memes or some sort of internet culture. And yet it's commanding so much in terms of people, how much people have actually paid for it. So what's going on? Are we seeing a bubble? Are we seeing a change in the artistic tastes of people in recent history? And I think this really brings a very good sort of topic that we can really talk about and discuss tonight. Really, what's happening? As with many things coming out from the crypto world, there's a lot of mystery. And I think we can really sort of understand many of those questions, and potentially even whether it is a bubble, by really looking at the art world itself and how much has really changed. And it really contextualizes everything that's happening. So art, for the longest time, has been something that's been part of human history, from the earliest art in caves to obviously Renaissance period and whatnot, and it certainly has grown a lot. But when we usually think of art, we think of, for example, the piece behind me, oil paintings that are very grandiose, and certainly we've seen auctions of these being sold for significant prices, and understandably so. They have such a historical significance. They are also so complex in how they're done and so meticulous that to some people it is explainable why command such a price. And that really has been art, and art like these in the past were really done by artisans, these artists who were more or less trying to pursue something very creative and perhaps some sort of artistic truth or some sort of expression. Many times also maybe a social commentary, maybe within a context of history, why they did a certain piece. So in essence, you're buying a piece of history. It has a lot to say about the time itself, and it is clearly inspired by such things. But what happened after, you would say, after the Second World War, around the 50s and onwards, was really the rise of something called formalism. So we are talking about a lot of artists actually trying to move beyond the sort of classic arts and more towards, rather than focusing on the context of art and more or less like, trying to depict these contexts of history of time, for example, certain works like that, they wanted to focus more on the aesthetics. And they believe that the more aesthetically focused it is, just purely on the colors and really the art itself, actually the closer we are to some sort of artistic truth. It's not colored by objects, things, or history or context. So art became, in essence, more and more abstract, more about colors and lines, and perhaps starting to look very strange and very modern today. We're seeing these dashes of colors and lines and specks, and just very different from classic arts. And the proponents of the formalists and formalist artists would say that what they're doing is actually truly artistic. It's purely an expression of art itself. And that really became very, very popular from that period in that late 20th century, really. And it really grew. By the time, you would say around 70s and onwards, there was also perhaps a proliferation of too many formalist artists that a lot of critics of art started to actually look into it critically, and they claimed that what we were seeing was a post-formalism, this sort of zombie formalism, where we're seeing a lot of these young artists just essentially doing the same things, very simple looking art, just with a lot of colors. And although they claim it's original, it is very unoriginal, many of it devoid of meaning. So a lot of people being very, very sort of critical of what was really happening with these formalist artists, even saying that a lot of the sort of process that went into making them was so simple that, you know, it's just so different. It's a departure from the magnificent art that we've seen in the past. Now, again, this is a matter of taste. This is a matter of really how taste could change over time. But really from the 80s onwards, and around the 80s, that was really a time when the art world saw its biggest sort of change. What happened really was, we would say that the emergence of sort of the art world today, but what was really happening was really the start of the commercialization of art. So around that period, in the 80s and onwards, we're seeing a few significant changes globally, especially in the places that, you know, are quite famous for art, but really the rise of more spending power overall in many economies as they sort of grew in that period, and also the rise of media, but media intermixed with the rise of these international art auction houses like Christie's and Sotheby's and their marketing efforts, and a lot of, you know, focus on auction setting and selling art, especially the formalist sort of art that we talked about, and the sort of simple abstract looking art. And all of a sudden, with so much coverage, so much money going around, and so much focus in the news, we were really seeing the emergence of the commercial art world that we know today. And so a lot of the artists themselves, they actually became brands. For example, Andy Warhol, he became an international brand, and every piece of art that he produced just became internationally very successful, commercially speaking, especially being pushed by these auction houses. They were trying to commercialize it as much as possible. And all the news coverage on the, you know, art world really was about how certain pieces would sell for so much, quite a lot of money, and a lot of intrigue about the art world. In the same sense, we're talking about NFTs today. And that really led to an overall commercialization of art, as many artists started to realize that they were really in an art market, and many of them starting, especially formalist artists, the artists that are very, you know, abstract and sort of modern, pursuing artworks that are reflective of trends and more or less trying to, you know, create art based on the potential commercial value that they could get. And this is what some of the art critics are saying was said back then, rather than focusing on just the pursuit of art alone. And so they realized that they were in this art market, and a lot of focus on that. But really, then we saw the emergence of the sort of art commerce, you could say. And what's really fascinating is that, again, a lot of the art pieces that are sold from the 80s onwards, even to modern times, especially a lot of the more abstract looking art, or the formalist or zombie formalist art, it doesn't make sense to people. For example, a very blank canvas with a few specks could be worth, you know, close to $100 million, for example, or maybe some random pile that's been made into a sculpture could be worth just insane amounts of money, in the millions, tens of millions, and it doesn't make any sense to many people looking at it. And it depends on what perspective you look at, but from what we have just described, the reason why this was really happening was just art became very commercialized. And what was also sort of, you know, driving the commercialization has also been just the nature of the art commerce world itself. Many of the people who are able to afford being at these auctions and actually bid and purchase art, a lot of them actually rely on art advisors. And a lot of these people, now knowing that, you know, to actually dabble in art is also to dabble in a commercial market, they also started to see the collection of art, not so much about perhaps a pursuit of an aesthetic collection of what looks good for my home and whatnot, but as a collection of almost an investment portfolio. So they would have these art advisors and all these advisors that would tell them what is a good piece, and a big factor of what is a good piece is a consideration of what is technically a good investment piece. And so these art advisors mainly would look at the trends and try and basically anticipate what would be, highly respected in a certain market, and that would be the ones they propose. And with enough of them advising more or less the same things, that's what we start to see certain trends emerging, certain formulas are being accepted as being, very hype, and so this sort of thing. When you really look at the sort of commercial economics behind art, it doesn't make any sense, especially when we look at it in the sort of post-formalist and zombie formalist sort of world, where art was really more about, more or less investment, but the things that drive it mainly is very irrational desires, and it's really hard to anticipate what would actually be accepted as actually very good art, especially when it's art like that. But a few things, usually certain trends certainly would indicate they could be. For example, one thing is novelty, for example. Very novel concepts tend to actually do well in this sort of environment. But essentially, besides the fact that we have these subject matters which are totally very abstract and non-understandable, it was also about, to summarize, it was also about the investment potential, and they tried to look at it through many different ways, and the historical trends or recent historical trends of what would actually sell well. But the third very interesting thing that's also going on behind the scenes of art world is also the self-interest or the conflict of interest. So now that art has become so commercialized, as with many things, there's an interest to make more money from it. And many of the art collectors actually are perpetuating the commercialization of art, or of these formalist art, or these art that people can't understand. So for example, very famously, Warhol collectors, one of them in particular, I will not say who, but apparently after having, bought Warhols, he would actually bid and actually buy other Warhols with insane amounts of bids, just to sort of increase the price of Warhols overall, because that is the art that he currently had in his collection, and to him it's almost like marketing a brand. So art became less about what we mentioned before in history, this thing that was about some commentary, some expression of creativity or some sort of higher truth, about the pursuit of those things, but more about this very commercial thing that is not necessarily understandable in what is actually being depicted, but more about what is actually trendy, what is actually novel, and also potentially, a lot of people behind the scenes trying to prop up certain things as art. Of course, the result of this is many of the collectors, comparatively speaking, of formalistic art, post-formalistic art, so these zombie formalists, these sort of very abstract art, they tend to be the ones in the art world that can get burnt much more easily compared to collectors of classic art. If we look at the historical comparison between sales, many famous collectors of such art have actually been burned. They would spend a lot on certain pieces, but actually when they sold it, they made losses, and an easy internet search would show that. So that, of course, is, you could say, one of the negative byproducts of how commercialized the art world had actually become. Now, how does this all make sense with NFTs? If you understand just everything we've just discussed, the NFT phenomenon is totally understandable. It pretty much highlights the sort of commercial aspects of art world today, and NFTs are slowly getting pushed into the same sort of category. So from the very first perspective, when you look at many of the NFT arts, these digital arts, yeah, they are essentially, a lot of them look like memes. But again, when you look at how art has developed, especially post-formalism, a lot of it doesn't make sense by subject matter. A lot of it can be very simple or just nonsensical, totally not sensible. But again, that isn't the key factor. The two key factors really have been so far in art world has been really about the commercial value potentially of it. And for the NFTs, they do have those signs. They are very novel, and certainly the idea of the crypto world is very trendy right now. And so just by these things alone, we can understand why there's so much hype for the NFTs, even from some people from the art world. some potential collectors would actually look into it just for the same reasons they would look into art, because perhaps they are not looking at it in the same way that an artist might look at it, or a person who is perhaps more artistically inclined would look at it. So to those people, it doesn't make sense, but to most people, especially from a commercial perspective, as something that is part of the portfolio, it could make sense. But does it actually mean that it is a sustainable thing? I think only time will tell. However, if anything we can learn from the commercialization of art world post-formalism, these zombie formalists, is that because much of this is driven by the superficial commercialization, it also means that many of these decisions, these investments in certain pieces, could essentially be very, very unsustainable. Same thing with NFTs, could very much be too much about speculation, and then on speculation alone, when those things change, especially when the novelty or more or less a trendiness of the acceptance in the sort of art market changes, then it's gone. Essentially the same thing compared to other arts, more classic arts. That is certainly one thing that at least from an investment perspective, one should be very cautious of. But one thing that we don't realize as well is that behind the economics of the current rise of NFTs is also a lot of self-interest because of just how commercial it is. So for example, and I'll try not to name names, but for example, the purchasers of Beeple's latest work at Christie's are actually the founders of a crypto fund themselves. And easily you can search this up. But prior to buying that piece for $69 million, they've actually purchased other of Beeple's pieces before the actual auction. So they already own Beeple's pieces in the same sense that the Warhol collector had. But what's even more interesting is that they're running a crypto fund that generally invests in many things, NFT art being one of them. And the previous Beeple pieces that they actually had owned, they had been selling off the ownership, the partial ownership of it as tokens, these B20 tokens to people. And what we know is that from the recent purchase of the $69 million Beeple's piece, the price of the tokens that they've been issuing based on the previous collection had actually gone up close to 2,000%, at least at that time. So again, that's a lot of self-interest. They might not be buying it as an artist, where they are buying it because they are promoting, again, their own crypto fund. And I think what we will see with NFTs is many participants in the NFT boom or the NFT craze, NFT world, that are actually driven for the same sort of reasons, operating not so much as art collectors in their traditional sense, but perhaps much more as these crypto enthusiasts, these investors with their own interests in mind and trying to commercialize it as much as possible. So does that mean it'll be sustainable? I think if you take a moment to think about everything that's discussed, there are signs that indicate that we have to be very cautious. Again, the blockchain technology and the technology behind cryptos it's just amazing, really. Has the potential to revolutionize many things, but everything is still very infantile. Everything is still, under rapid development. So we do have to be very cautious about these developments and really try and take this more critical approach to see what's really happening behind the scenes. So with everything discussed, it really does challenge the notion that, NFTs are just this new sort of art and maybe we don't understand it. Perhaps it's a totally different class of thing on its own, and it's more reflecting a sort of commercial trend of art rather than truly art itself, and from that perspective it can be understandable, and the prices and economics, everything we just discussed. So yes, just like many things that has been in recent developments, very fascinating indeed, and if you found this a very interesting discussion, do check out more pieces. We actually wrote articles on this, our authors at empirics.asia, but I hope you found that fascinating too.